Hello there. I just recently finished Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Presentation, Volume 1. I've not read Volume 2, and I probably won't for a long time, if ever, because it was quite enough to get a general understanding of Schopenhauer's thought to get through this book. More than enough, actually. Although, there's plenty more where that came from. So, I just want to give some thoughts, general thoughts on the book. They're going to not be that thorough because you can't get that thorough of an understanding of this book without dedicating a lot of time to it. And that means, like, if you want a thorough understanding of the book, you should probably just go and read it or watch, like, a whole lecture series on it. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give, like, a 10, 15-minute video, if even that. Just kind of my thoughts on the whole book. Whatever you can make of that. So, before I get into it, the book is separated into 4 books. You have The World as Presentation is book 1. The World as Will is book 2. Book 3 is Presentation and Art. Book 4, Will and Non-Will. And then he's separating this book into 4 books. But generally in philosophy, you'll have like book 1 is the foundational idea, which builds upon the idea of book 2, and then book 3 is built upon those ideas, and it's kind of a sequence of thoughts. Schopenhauer is trying to say, is suggesting that these 4 books put together all consist of one thought together that he's trying to generate, which this just clicked in my mind. I think that kind of goes with a lot of what I'm saying in my notes, that basically this isn't him kind of rationalizing all of this that he's bringing out. It's more like something within his mind, within his unconscious maybe, that he's trying to make conscious by translating it into words. So I'll get into that. I have some notes here that will help me clarify some things. So basically, book 1 essentially says that the world appears to us in a series of perceptions which are determined by the 4 principles of sufficient ground. Those are principles derived by Schopenhauer. So you can look those up if you want to. They're kind of helpful. All spatio-temporal experience is just that, experience, and the world as it is presented to us should not be confused with the world as a thing in itself. The world is presentation. Then book 2 essentially says that the world as a thing in itself is will. By will, he means something like the incessant self-objectivization from one actual state to the next. So you have an antecedent actual state which holds all the potential within it for the ever inchoate actual state that arises out of it at all times. That's a little complicated, but that's all right. And humans, through their higher cognizance, become conscious of this will as this omnipresent force which guides the whole universe from the micro to the macro and perhaps beyond. And basically the human being is just as much a manifestation of that omnipresent will as a grain of sand or a quasar out in some galactic storm way out there. Then book 3 essentially says that all true art arises not from human willing, as in conscious willing and imagination or whatever, but rather from a sort of altered mind state achieved by human beings when they connect with their innermost essence. And that same innermost essence is that of the universe, which is this omnipresent will which guides the universe in all its forms. So in short, art is kind of like a channeling of the universal will. That's Schopenhauer calls that genius. So genius is not like being incredibly smart, having a super high IQ. Genius is when you channel that universal will into your art. And I think Schopenhauer was channeling the universal will into his art, which was a book. It's not necessarily considered art, although it's debatable, but it's a beautiful piece of literature, we can say that. So then book 4 said that because our position both as objectivized phenomena of this grand universal will and as this will in itself, we find ourselves in a constant state of interconnected, inescapable suffering, which is the natural condition of the universal will's self-objectivization. And the only way out of this suffering is to achieve pure, higher, will-less condition, which has been found in saints and ascetics, spiritualists, etc., all of whom represent various religious traditions whose truths and ethical codes demonstrate manifestations of this will, which has here been expressed in philosophical rather than mythical, religious, or experiential form. So overall, I resonated with this book and understood the general concepts quite easily for how tediously long and difficult this book was. It really feels like Schopenhauer just absorbed these Vedic and Buddhist ideas into his unconscious pools or some transcendent realm supervening upon these pools, and he channeled these ideas into German in order to bring this transmission into his part of the world. Perhaps it's not just Vedic and Buddhist ideas, but ideas from the universe, universal truths, which have been translated across the eons into these various religions, whose truths seem to find themselves so seamlessly in parallel, telling stories of virtue and goodness and truth and purity and love and compassion. All of these being the true paths meant for true happiness and enlightenment, while the paths of vice and evil and falsity and corruption and hatred and apathy are the paths made for suffering and hell and enslavement and illusion. The latter seems more plausible, for these are indeed universal truths to be found in all deeply spiritual people. So then it's quite a shame that Schopenhauer still remains such a hard materialist and calls all of these religious saints merely superstitious, even though he's recognizing them as geniuses who have clearly uncovered the secrets out of human misery, which he clearly recognized. It's pretty astounding, really, how systematically and logically he presented his thought in a way that made such seamless sense, showing how, on the one hand, humans are mere phenomena of the universe, bound to the illusion of mere appearance, mere grains of sand in a vast cosmic ocean of infinitude. While on the other hand, each individual human, through his perception of the universe, gives rise to the very existence of this whole universe for himself as manifestation of the universal will, which he essentially and wholly is. That is to say, in one aspect, the human is yet another object, just a sad little insignificant individual generated by the cosmic will, a grain of sand. In another aspect, the human is this cosmic will itself, cognizant of itself, so the whole cosmic will, brought to cognition of itself, albeit sometimes in a limited fashion, and in a sense, the whole universe and the whole will is wholly dependent upon the human for its own existence. Herein lies the linking between the microcosm and the macrocosm, whereby the human being is the whole universe itself, bringing itself into self-cognizance in order to will itself into existence in all of its infinite parts, each equally whole in its universal existence, each equally nothing in face of the totality of infinitude, a totality which cannot be total by the fact that it is unbounded. In other words, this is absolute madness. And then, from this system, he derives the interconnected samsara characterization of suffering of all living beings and speaks of compassion towards others being the only path toward behavior which can be called good from an ethical standpoint. So how the foundation of all of our flawed behavior lies in our flawed perception of self and other as separate, when in reality they are united manifestations of the same universal will. How by inflicting harm upon the other, we are only inflicting harm upon the very will which we ourselves are in our innermost essence. How each act of harm against another is straightforwardly an act against oneself, and thus only by the nullification of egoism and ego might we find some kind of peaceful resolution within ourselves by willing our own will to life away and denying the very system which gave birth to our bodies, transcending them through ascetic refusal to indulge in any sensory gratification, even that most needed for life. How in this nullification of our will for life, we are in fact nullifying the very will of the whole ineffable universe, the cosmic will, the God will, Brahman, whatever you want to call it. But at the very same time, since in our very most innermost essence, we are that will, and nothing but that will, objectivized by itself into a human body, it is this very will itself which denies itself, and so in a sense denies those who make this seeming free choice to deny the will from which they arise. And so, in a sense, those who make this seeming free choice to deny the will from which they arise are in fact nothing but that very will itself. And so there arises an endless oscillation between fate and free will, which links our wills to that divine cosmic will which each of us is. Does that make any sense? Yes. Now that's a mouthful. And what I mean to say is that the transmission I've received myself is this: fate and free will are in inseparable oscillation, descended from the higher realms of complexity, whereby the very possibility of this impossibly complex universe has been, always will be, and always is made. That is to say, I myself, me, am wholly bound by fate, for all my choices are only manifestations of this cosmic will, which I am not conscious of, which dictates simultaneously the births of stars and galaxies, and the births of mold on my strawberries, and the births of a new seahorse down in the depths of the Red Sea, if such seahorses exist. At the very same time, I myself, me, this guy, this person, am wholly free in and responsible for every single choice I make, absolutely independently from the seeming interconnected causal sphere. And even though I am a material being, by my very nature, I transcend my own materiality in every single choice I make, and I am thus entirely independent from all causality. So, in that sense, I am myself the whole universal will of God, and so I can do whatever the fuck I want. And then a whole universe is created out of each of my choices, because this is my own universe, appearing to me through my own perception of it, without which it would cease existing totally. For this, my own universe, is but a collection of the phenomena of my perception, and every individual human being finds himself equally at the center of this fated universe, freely creating the very chains of the fate to which he is bound, or she. It's a circle, an endless, inevitable cycle, only escapable by ascendant transcendence over the senses and the samsaric cycle of suffering, which I myself have witnessed mystically firsthand in a grove at Northern Nights during a sound healing where the whole interconnected suffering web of all suffering beings in the entire universe was embodied within me. And I felt how every time that I inflicted suffering on another or myself, I was just beating myself up, creating this incessant web of suffering. And the answer to the problem, the solution to the problem, is free will. That's the mystical experience that I had in the Redwoods, which was aligned exactly with what Schopenhauer is saying. And so, from this, I can further say that these philosophers and writers and artists and all these guys, geniuses, Schopenhauer calls them, all of them are simply channeling this universal cosmic will of God. This God, the supreme God which rules the whole universe in all of its polycosmic layers. That's why people write, why they make art, why they create things, why they live. It's the reason for our existence. It's in order to pour these divine messages into as many languages as possible, be they the languages of religion, of painting, of philosophy, of English, of French, or of Hindi, or dog barking, or movies, or blogs, or sculpting, or poetry. It's all the same. It's all the Platonic ion. And Schopenhauer said essentially the same thing as Plato about art. But it all extends far beyond that. Essentially, each human being has within them a deep, authentic self to which he or she can connect at all times. And once that authentic connection is established, the seamless message arises from them, a translation of the ineffable into words, an expression of divinity for us to remember the very divinity from which each of us arises. Now, Schopenhauer would not necessarily agree with the divine aspect of it, but fuck you, Schopenhauer. I hope he didn't hear that in his ensouled form. This is the universe coming into consciousness to observe itself from a multitude of perspectives. That's what each one of us is. The whole universe transmitting messages to itself into its infinite multiplicity in order to learn from itself what its boundless potential holds. What its boundless potential holds and actualizes when given freedom and love and harmony. These philosophers aren't just writing these things down to think. They're transmitting messages from the higher realms of consciousness. And that's what I'm here on this planet to do. I don't even know where this came from. Oh, I guess that's the end of my message. Now, I would also maybe relate this to Carl Jung and the collective unconscious. Yeah.